Hi, I'm Jasper, and I'm going to be teaching you how to play Nut Hunt, a game of territorial squirrel today. The game is for 1 to 5 players. It is the squirrel placement game of the year. Probably the only squirrel placement game of the year, but we aren't sure about that. So we're teaching on Tabletop Simulator today because it's a little bit easier to show you how it works. Although all of these components, we have corresponding components in the actual game. So to get started, we're just going to deal out the board. And first, I'm going to show some of these components. First, there are the squirrel meeples. Each color has its own squirrel meeples that are their own shape, which are pretty cool. Then these ball meeples are the squirrel nests. You have the fox, and you have the fox die. So the point of a game of Nut Hunt is each player is going to have objective cards, secret objective cards that are in their hand, and objective cards are only scored at the end of the game. So if we take a look right here at one of these objective cards, each objective card refers to 2 location tiles on the board. So in this case, Frolic Field and the Crag, which we can see right here and right here. Now your goal when playing Nut Hunt is to occupy both endpoints of the objective with some number of squirrels and or squirrel nests, and control a contiguous run of territory connecting them. So in this case, the orange player would have achieved Frolic Field to the Crag. Now it's important to note that you only score objectives at the end of the game. So if you achieve an objective mid-game, you have to position your squirrels and squirrel nests so you can hold on to it to the end of the game when you get to score the points for it. So if you achieve an objective, then you score the base points of the objective, which in this case is 3 points, and you would also score what's called the distance bonus. And the distance bonus is the number of intervening tiles on the shortest possible route between the 2 endpoints. So in this case, it would be +2. So by achieving this objective, the orange player would get the base points of 3 plus 2 points for the distance bonus. And it doesn't matter if they took the long way around, you only ever score the shortest possible route. Now let's say the orange player failed the objective. Well, right, because it's not connected anymore, each objective that you have in your hand at the end of the game that you fail, you lose 2 points for. So in this case, the orange player would lose 2 points for failing this objective. At the end of the game, you are also going to score 2 points per squirrel nest that you have on the board. So that's the entirety of how you score points. You get 2 points per squirrel nest, the base points of each achieved objective, the distance bonus of each achieved objective, and then you lose 2 points for each failed objective. The easiest way to show how Nut Hunt plays is just to toss some squirrels and squirrel nests out on the board and just start in on a turn. So each player will have this convenient structure of a turn card in front of them, and on one side it has everything that happens in a turn of Nut Hunt and everything essentially that happens in a game of Nut Hunt. And on the other side is some quick references for how you build a squirrel nest and what triggers the end of the game. So a turn of Nut Hunt starts with moving the fox. So to move the fox, the active player, so we'll say the orange player in this case, would just roll the fox die, and then they would refer to the fox compass up here, and that tells you which direction the fox moves in. So in this case, the fox moves straight down into Mouse Meadow. Now to make this interesting, we're going to toss a couple of squirrels on Mouse Meadow so we can see what happens. So when the fox moves onto a tile, 2 things happen. First, any squirrels on that tile have to scatter. Now, when scattering squirrels, you always start with the active player, meaning the orange player, and then work around the table in turn order. To scatter squirrels, squirrels have to scatter into any adjacent tile other than where the fox just came from. You can never scatter directly to the tile that the fox just left. So the orange player would start and they could scatter their squirrels to any of these adjacent tiles. So let's say that they wanted to go here. If they had multiple squirrels on the same tile, they could either choose to split them up or send them to the same place. It would be their choice. And then the yellow player would scatter their squirrel as well. Squirrel nests are anchor points. They never scatter. So once a squirrel nest is placed, it is safe. It doesn't scatter from the fox or for any reason at all. But any other squirrels there would have to run away. Hi, Jasper here. I just wanted to stop in real quick and show you what would happen if during the fox movement phase, someone rolls a die and the fox would move off the board. So in this case, a 5 is rolled and that would send the fox right off over here off the board. So instead of moving off the board, I want you to imagine that the board of Nut Hunt is a giant wrestling ring and the fox bounces off the edge and moves in the opposite direction. After the fox moves onto a tile and squirrels scatter, then the active player forages for 2 nuts. And every turn, the active player gets 2 nuts. And the nuts that the active player forages for are based on the tile that the fox moved onto. So if we look at Mouse Meadow where the fox just landed, we see that on the bottom left there is the forage value of Mouse Meadow. Now Mouse Meadow, the forage is only acorns, which means that the active player could take 2 nuts among any combination of just acorns in this case, and that makes more sense when you look at some other tiles that have multiple nuts in the forage value, right? Briar Run is acorn and pecan, so if the fox had moved on to Briar Run, the active player would take either 2 acorn, 2 pecan, or 1 of each. But the fox moved on to Mouse Meadow, so the orange player gets 2 acorn in this case. And again, if we look around the board, different tiles have different forage values. So Fairy Ring over here, the forage is wild. So if the fox had moved on to Fairy Ring, the active player could take any combination of 2 nuts, whatever they want. So maybe a pecan and a chestnut or some such. So that's the fox movement phase. That happens every turn. The fox moves, squirrels scatter, and the active player forages for 2 nuts. Then the active player gets to take 1 optional action, and it's important to note that you only get 1 optional action per turn. The 3 optional actions are to recruit a squirrel, to hassle a fox, or to scout an objective. And these are in the order of probably how frequently you'll do each of them in a game of Nut Hunt. So the first optional action is to recruit a squirrel. Recruiting a squirrel is exactly like what it sounds like. It is pay to play. You pay nut cards to place the squirrel on the board. So if we make one of these tiles, if we make it large, you'll see that on the bottom right, each tile has some value of nuts. So in this case, the tangle has 1 acorn and 1 chestnut. That is the recruit cost of the tile, which is how much it costs to place a squirrel on the tile. When recruiting a squirrel as the optional action, there are only 2 rules that you have to follow. 1, you have to be able to pay the recruit cost of the tile that you want to place the squirrel on. And 2, you can never place a squirrel on a tile that the fox is on. So let's say that the orange player, for their turn, they wanted to place a squirrel on the tangle. Well, they have an acorn and they have a chestnut, so they could go ahead and pay those and place a squirrel on the tangle. Or alternatively, if they hadn't done that, let's say that they wanted to place a squirrel on Briar Run. Well, Briar Run is 1 acorn and 1 pecan, and they have that, so they can place a squirrel on Briar Run. And it's important to note, it doesn't matter that the green player has a nest on Briar Run, or if another player has squirrels there. You can place a squirrel anywhere on the board as long as you can pay the recruit cost and the fox isn't on that tile. The second optional action is to hassle the fox. To hassle the fox, you need to have either squirrels and or a squirrel nest in a tile adjacent to the fox. So just to demonstrate this, I'm going to toss a squirrel nest up here for now. So that means the orange player has a squirrel nest here, squirrels here, a squirrel here, and squirrels here. So the orange player could hassle the fox into any of these 4 territories. To hassle the fox, you pull the fox onto a tile that you have a squirrel or squirrel nest adjacent to it, and then 2 things happen. As you guessed, squirrels have to scatter from the fox. Again, they can go to the same place or they can split up, and you still have to follow that same rule where you can't scatter squirrels directly where the fox is coming from when the fox is moving into a tile. Then, for your trouble of hassling the fox, the active player would forage for 1 nut And as always, you always forage for nuts based on where the fox is. The idea is that the squirrels see where the fox is going and they gather up all the nuts they can before the fox gets there. So in this case, the orange player would get 1 pecan for their trouble of hassling the fox. The third optional action is to scout an objective. To scout an objective, you would look at the top 2 cards of the objective deck, and then you would keep up to 1 of them. So you could either keep 0 or 1 of these objective cards based on what you think that you can achieve. So the orange player would probably think that they could achieve Willow Wallow to the crag, so they would keep that objective and they would discard the other off to the side. It's important to note that once an objective card is in your hand, you cannot get rid of it. So you want to be careful about what objective cards you are taking, because if you have objective cards in your hand at the end of the game that you do not achieve, you lose 2 points for each of them. All right, so that's recruiting a squirrel, hassling the fox, and scouting an objective, but there's also a free action. So sometimes you'll get a ton of one type of nut, and you don't have any use for it. Maybe you want to recruit a squirrel and you need walnuts instead of pecan. Well, as a free action at any time, you can trade in 3 of one type of nut for 1 of any other type of nut. So in this case, the orange player could trade in these 3 pecan, and they could grab a walnut. And that's a free action that doesn't count as your optional action. So you could trade 3 nuts for 1 of another nut and then use that new nut in your recruit a squirrel action. That's completely allowed. All right. So we talked about the fox moving, foraging for nuts, and then the optional actions, recruiting a squirrel, hassling the fox, and scouting an objective. But we haven't really talked about squirrel nests. We know that they're worth 2 points at the end of the game. We also know that they're anchors that don't scatter from the fox. How are they built? And also, it's important to note, they're more than just worth 2 points at the end of the game. Squirrel nests also trigger the end of the game. As soon as a player places their 4th squirrel nest on the board, that triggers the end of the game. You finish mandatory actions, which is just squirrel scattering, and then the game's over. There's no more recruiting, no more hassling the fox, no more foraging. So they're very, very important, both for timing when you want to end the game, but also for securing the tiles that are really important for your territory. So how do you get them? So you get a squirrel nest as soon as a player places their 3rd squirrel on a tile. As a mandatory action, they must remove those 3 squirrels and replace them with a squirrel nest. And that's mandatory. They don't get a choice in the matter. If a player builds a squirrel nest on a tile where another player has a squirrel, all opposing squirrels have to scatter off of that tile. Now, the only rule when scattering from a nest being built is you cannot go directly to where the fox is. So you could go to, the yellow player could send their squirrel to any of these 4 tiles. So maybe they would send it right up there. Now, it is possible for squirrels to come back onto that tile, either because they're scattered onto the tile or they get recruited directly onto it. It's also completely possible for 2 or more players to each have squirrel nests on the same tile. If that happens, neither nest has to scatter from the other nest being built. The squirrels are happy and at home and cozied up in their nests. All right. That's the entirety of how Nut Hunt is played, but there is also a little bit of setup, and before that, I want to point out 2 special tiles that are on the board. So the 2 special tiles are the Frog Pond and the Pine Barrens, which are right here. So we make these big. So the Frog Pond has a forage of wild, so if the fox were to move onto it, the active player could take any combination of 2 nuts. And then the Frog Pond also says no entry and no recruiting. What that means is that you cannot pay nuts to recruit squirrels onto the Frog Pond. It also means that squirrels can't get scattered onto the Frog Pond. The Frog Pond is completely off limits to squirrels. The fox, however, fox can go on the Frog Pond. The fox, it turns out, is an excellent swimmer. The second important tile, or sort of different tile, is the Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens says no recruiting. What that means is you cannot pay nuts to place a squirrel, to recruit a squirrel onto the Pine Barrens. However, squirrels may be scattered onto the Pine Barrens either from the fox or from an opposing player building a squirrel nest. It's important to note that the Pine Barrens is on objective cards, and those objectives are worth the most points. They're also the hardest to achieve. And since the board is randomly generated every game, where the Frog Pond are and where the Pine Barrens are is going to change every game and change the feel of the game. So now that we know the rules to Nut Hunt, how do we get started? Well, first, you'll notice that each player starts with 3 objective cards. Before the game begins, each player needs to discard 1 objective card, and they'll discard it off here to the side. So each player is going to start with 2 objective cards in their hand. Each player is also going to start with 2 squirrels on the board and 4 nut cards in their hand. And the way that this works is the player who goes first is whoever most recently ate a nut. And I had some pecans earlier, so I'll be the first player in this sample game. So the way that works is if you look at the board, you'll notice that there are these green bordered tiles. These are the starting tiles. The green bordered starting tiles, they're the tiles that usually cost 2 to build in, and they're the tiles that are available for placement at the beginning of the game. So to start the game, whoever the first player is would place a squirrel in any unoccupied green bordered starting tile. So let's say I want to place a squirrel in Briar Run for now. And then that player would forage for 2 nuts based on that tile. And this is the only time that you're foraging for nuts based on where squirrels are. Normally you're foraging based on where the fox moves into. But in this case, I could take either 2 acorn, 2 pecan, or 1 of each. So let's say that I want 2 pecan. Then we would go around the table, and the second player would place their first squirrel and forage for 2 nuts based on that tile. The third player would place. No, they already had a squirrel on there, trying to pull a fast one on us. Would place their squirrel and would forage for 2 nuts in that tile. Let's imagine that we're just playing with 3 players for now. So we would snake back around, and that third player would place their second squirrel and forage for 2 nuts. The second player would place their second squirrel and forage for 2 nuts, and then me, being the first player, I could place my second squirrel and I could forage for 2 nuts as well. That would be the entirety of setup. There is one small exception if you are playing with 5 players exactly and the center tile is green bordered. You'll notice that there are 10 green bordered starting tiles, so if you're playing with 5 players, then there wouldn't be enough green bordered tiles for everyone to place in an unoccupied tile if that center tile were green. So if those 2 conditions are met, then you would have the first player place, the second player place, third player, fourth player, fifth player. Then instead of that 5th player placing their second squirrel, you would have the 4th player place their second squirrel, then the third, the second, the first, and then at the very end, the 5th player could place their second squirrel in any green bordered starting tile, even if it has another squirrel in it already, other than where the fox is. And they would also forage as usual. And that's the one exception to setup, but it's not very common and it only occurs at 5 players. So normally you snake around and then snake right back. So after we've set up and we each have 2 objective cards and 4 nut cards, we would start off the game. And since I'm the first player, I would start off by just starting my turn by rolling the fox die. I would refer up here to the fox compass, move the fox, scatter squirrels on out of there, forage for my 2 nuts based on that tile that the fox landed on, and then I could take my optional action, which is recruit a squirrel, hassle the fox, or scout an objective. That is the entirety of a game of Nut Hunt. I hope that you enjoy it. There is also one optional rule, competitive rule, that we recommend for a 2-player variant. But this is how we normally play the game, and this is how we definitely recommend it also at 3, 4, or 5 players. All right, we're back. Now that you know how to play Nut Hunt, I just wanted to quickly cover the optional rule variant that we recommend for a 2-player, but it's completely optional. And if you're not a particularly competitive or cutthroat player, you don't have to worry about it at all. So in the competitive rule variant, in the normal rule variant, when a player builds a nest on a tile, any other opposing squirrels on that tile have to scatter on out of that tile. Well, if you're playing with the competitive optional rule variant, then when a player builds a nest on a tile, if there is if another player has only one squirrel on that tile, well, that squirrel gets destroyed. If another player has two squirrels on that tile, one of them gets destroyed, and then the other has to scatter as usual. And what this does is create a really interesting dynamic where instead of racing other players by building squirrels on the same tile, you'll often position your squirrels around your opponent's squirrels in the hope that you can get them scattered in one fell swoop, build a nest, and take them out of action. So it's a little bit more of a cerebral sort of game where you're positioning around your opponent as opposed to always sort of going for the objectives that you're going after.